welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to make this cute dress. I'll call it a mini ball dress for a little one, aged 3 to 6 months. You can see how cute it is, right? So this has a lot of layers, from the peplum to the tulle net to the lining, and then to the second lining that has the hard net layer. This is a very interesting tutorial. If you're new to my channel, welcome. Kindly click the subscribe button and click the bell so you get notified whenever I post new videos. And I just want to thank you guys for your support so far since I got back. And now let's get right into the tutorial. In my previous video, I showed us how to draft the pattern for this dress. If you don't know how to draft a bodice pattern for babies, especially for ages 3 to 6 months, I'm going to link that video in my description box. Go ahead and watch that. I've gone ahead to cut out my pattern pieces on fabric, and this is what I have right here. So here are the 2 pieces for the back. Here is the 1 piece for the front. I've cut it on my lining, and I've also gone ahead to stay my main fabric. I did none of that to my lining. So what I'm going to do right now is to take this to my sewing machine. Let me just illustrate this with my main fabric, okay? So I'm going to take this to my sewing machine. I'm going to sew the shoulder slope of front and back with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, because that is what I gave on my pattern. I'll do the same thing for this other piece, and then I'll go on to sew the side seam by a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then I'll repeat the same thing for my lining pieces as well. So after sewing, this is what the bodice looks like. So what I'm going to do is to place them on top of each other like this, with right sides touching right side, and then I'm going to go on to sew my zipper allowance, my zipper side, with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll do the same thing for the other side as well, and come show you guys what we are going to do next. So after sewing the 1/2 inch seam allowance, I'm going to turn my fabric right sides out like this, and I'm going to press this area down, press this side down as well, okay, so it lays nice and flat. Then I'll be sewing my neckline all around just as it is, okay, by that 1 centimeter that I gave as seam allowance. I'll repeat the same thing for my armhole as well, just as it is by that 1 centimeter seam allowance. So everything with wrong side of fabric touching wrong side of lining. I'm going to explain why we are doing this. So after sewing by that 1 centimeter seam allowance all around, okay, the method I want to use will require us that we would not need that 1 centimeter seam allowance around the neckline and around the armhole. So what I'm going to do right now is to trim it off such that I have just about 1/8 of an inch left from the stitch. Okay, so just very little that will be left after the stitch. So I'm just going to trim it off like this around my neckline as well as around the armhole, okay? The reason why I'm doing this is because we are going to be using a bias to cover up the neckline, and if we are using a bias, we do not need that seam allowance for that. And this is a much easier method to do. Turning your fabric can be actually quite complicated, especially if you're a beginner. So this is sort of like beginner friendly. So I'll go on to trim this around my neckline, around my armhole, very close to the stitch. So after trimming off the excess, very close to the stitch, what we are going to do to have a really nice finish around this part here is to use a bias tape to close it off. So I made bias tape from the fabric, from the main fabric. I have 2 tutorials on how you can make bias tape if you don't have a bias tape maker, and if you do have a bias tape maker, I'll link that up in my description box. Go ahead and watch that. Okay, so this is what I'm going to use to sew this up. This bias tape is 3/4 inches, so I'm going to place it like this, sew around, and then turn it like this and use that to cover it all around, okay? So after sewing everything up, this is what it looks like. I've sewn the bias tape to the armhole. So this is what we have, okay? So what we want to do next is to go on to cut the lining for this dress, and I'm going to be cutting a 180-degree flare. So the waist is 18.5. We're going to add 3 inches to that. That will come to 21.5, and we're going to divide that 21.5 inches by 3.14, and that will give us 6.84. To that 6.84, we're going to add 8.5 inches, and that will give us approximately 15.34. That 8.5 inches is going to be the length of the flare, inclusive of seam allowance at the bottom. So here is my fabric now. My fabric is measuring around 16 inches by 16 inches on fold. It is folded twice, okay? If we open it up, it is going to measure 32 inches on one side and 16 inches on the other side. So what I'm going to do is to come to the folded part of the fabric, which is right here. Like I said, it is folded into 2. I'm going to first of all mark that 6.84 inches. The 3 inches that we added to the waist measurement is for seam allowance. So I'm going to come right here, the 6.84 inches that we calculated. I'm going to come to this folded edge and mark it. We have 6.5, we have 6.75 inches, and that mark that is right after the 6.75 inches is what we are going to use, which is 6.825. So I'm just going to go with that, 6.825, and I'll be marking it all around. That mark is right after 6.75 and it is before 7 inches. So that's a 6.825 that we are marking. I'll just come right there and mark that. So after marking, I'll go on to join the points like so. And then I'll add half an inch at the top right here. So the next thing I did was to come right here from the lower mark that we have here. I marked the 8.5 inches for the length of my peplum. Okay, so that is what I did here. And I'll go on to connect the points like this. And then I'm going to cut my fabric following this mark that we have here and this mark that we have right on top. After cutting, this is what we have. The next thing I'm going to do is to take this to my sewing machine. I'm going to hem the bottom of the flare as well as hem this side, which is going to go around where my zipper is. I'll hem the 2 sides, hem the bottom. So after sewing my 180-degree flare lining, this is what I have. The next thing I'm going to do is to work on the peplum that we want to attach to this baby dress. So I'll be cutting flare for this dress, which will lay on top of the soft net. And the waist circumference, of course, is 18.5 inches. We're going to add 3 inches for seam allowance to that, and that will come to 21.5 inches. So that 21.5 inches, we're going to divide it by 6.28 because we are making a 360-degree flare. We are cutting a 360-degree flare, and that will give us 3.4. So because I don't have 3.4 inches on my tape rule, I'm going to approximate this to 3.5. Okay, so I'm going to come right here at this folded part. I'm going to mark 3.5 inches all around. Okay. And then I'll go on to connect the points. So what I'm going to do right now is to add a half an inch seam allowance at the top, just like this. Now I want the length to be 8 inches, and this will include seam allowance at the bottom. We're going to be lining this peplum flare. So what I'm going to do is to mark that 8 inches from this mark below. So I have 8 inches here. I'll just keep marking that 8 inches until I get to the other end. So now that I have my 8 inches marked, what I'm going to do is to go on to cut my fabric out from the mark above and then this mark that we have right here at the bottom. So this is our flare now. I'll go on to replicate what I have here on my lining fabric, and we are going to interface this main fabric with paper stay. So after staying the main fabric of the peplum, I went on to use this as pattern to cut the lining fabric, and this is what I have. So I've placed them on top of each other with right sides touching. What I'm going to do right now is to cut one end because we are going to be attaching this to a zipper. So I just fold it into 2 like this. I look for one end and cut. That's the part that we will use as zipper allowance. So I'm going to take this to my sewing machine. Sew all the way around like this. Okay, I'm going to sew here short, sew this part till I get right back to the other side, and then sew this part short. The only part that is going to be open will be this waist area. So after sewing, this is what I have. While I was sewing this bottom part, I attached hemming tape to it. So instead of sewing and top stitching, I just attached it. By the time I turn it and press it, it is going to look nice and flat as if I top stitched. Okay, so that's what I did for this part. I'll go on to notch this edge as well as right here. I'll notch it like so. I'll also go on to notch all around this bottom part so that it is easy for me to press it nice and flat. Okay, so just go on to create tiny notches around this circular edge. And then I'll turn this right sides out and give it a very, very good press. So after pressing, this is what I have. Can you see that I did not even have to top stitch to get it to lay nice and flat? If you use that hemming gum, you're going to get the same results as top stitching. So now that we have this done, we're going to work on the 2 net layer. So for the 2 nets, I'm using 2 yards of soft net cut to 10 inches into 6 places. Okay, so each layer is measuring 10 inches in length and is in 6 places. So 2 yards will come to 72 inches, which is approximately times 4 of the waist circumference of the child. And the length is by 60. That is why I cut it to 10 inches in 6 places. So what I've done was to run a gathered stitch right at the top here to hold everything in place. And then I'll go on to pull the thread so that I can gather it to that waist circumference plus 2 inches. So I'm going to be gathering this to 20.5 inches because the waist circumference is 18.5. All right. Next thing I did was to cut a belt piece that is measuring 4 inches in width and 24.5 inches in length, such that by the time we fold it and sew it by ½ inch, it is going to come down to 1.5 inches on fold. So what I'm going to do right now is to make one side of this belt pointed. So I'll just fold it like this. I fold it into 2. I'm going to mark 2 inches upwards. And this 2-inch mark, I'll connect it to this pointed edge here. Just like this. And we are going to cut this out. So what I've done here, I'll repeat it for this one. I attached interfacing to my fabric in order to, give it a little bit of body. So I used paper stay for this. So now that we have this all cut out, I'm going to place it on top of each other like this, fold it into 2 with right sides touching, and I'll go on to sew by 1/4 inch on this side and by 1/4 inch on this side. So after sewing, this is what I have. I only sewed the bottom by 1/4 inch and I sewed the side by ½ inch. So I'm going to use my fabric scissors to turn this belt right sides out, and once I turn it right sides out, I will go on to give this a very, very good press. So after pressing my belt piece, I went on to attach it to the side seam area of the main fabric, about 3/4 inches from the edge of the fabric, because we're going to be sewing this bodice by ½ inch to the skirt part in order to form the ball dress, and we don't want the belt piece to get in the way. So this is what I have. Meanwhile, I wanted to mention something, that in order for my belt also not to get in the way, I had to increase the seam allowance at the edge of the belt piece. I had to sew it in more so that the belt would not get in the way, okay, and so that it would be easy for me to sew at the side seam. So now that we have our belt pieces sewn into the bodice, what we want to do is to attach the other fabric pieces. Now I made a little bit of adjustment to my peplum and to the lining piece. So I had to reduce the length of the peplum piece so that it doesn't cover the entire toe net. Okay, the length of the toe net is 10 inches and this was reduced to 6 inches so that there is a 4-inch difference and our toe net is visible from the outside. I did the same thing for the lining piece as well, reduced it to 6 inches. Now the fact that we have reduced this, especially because I did it around the waist area, it means that the waist circumference will be a lot more than we anticipated. So what I'm going to do is to turn this into pleats while I'm sewing in order for us to accommodate the waist circumference of this child, which is 18.5 inches. So these are the pieces that we are going to be attaching to the bodice. I'm going to show you all the pieces. So right here is the bodice, okay? Right here is the peplum, which is going to be on the outermost part. It is going to be followed by the 2 nets, which I have gathered and sewn to the waist circumference plus 2 inches. It will be followed by this lining, and then the last piece, which this part is going to touch the body of the child, okay? This part will be the last piece on the inside. The peplum will be the first piece on the outside. So I hope you understand what I mean by that. in order for you to see how we made this, I have a tutorial on that. I'm going to link it up in the description box, so go ahead and watch that so you know how to make something like this. This helps to make the ball dress fuller or appear fuller. This part around the lining where we have the hard net is exactly the same length as what we have here for the bodice. So I'm going to be using this as a guide. Okay, I'm going to be attaching everything first onto this layer before we attach it to the bodice. Now this part right here, this is how it is going to go on the bodice. So can you see the right side of my lining having the hard net is going to touch the wrong side of the fabric. Okay, so the layers I'm going to join first are this one, and then the next layer is the lining, and I'm placing the wrong side of my lining touching the hard net, so it is going to go like this. What I want to do right now is to pin this end, the two ends. I'm going to pin the two ends. Remember I said that I reduced the length so that it is not too long, so I need to accommodate for the extra length that I have now. So I'm just going to pin the two ends just like this. Okay, and I'm going to pleat along the way as I sew. Just do random pleats. It doesn't necessarily have to be uniform since it's just the lining, so I'm just going to do random pleats to hold this together. So after sewing these two pieces on together, the next piece that we are going to sew on is the soft net piece. Okay, so I'm just going to place it right on top of this, and I'll go on to sew everything together. So after attaching the soft net to the two lining layers, the next thing I'm going to do is to attach the peplum to the bodice. So I'm going to be attaching the peplum with the right side touching, but first I will attach this part right here. It now depends on whether you want to include this in the zipper allowance. Okay, if you don't want to include it in the zipper allowance, all you need to do is sew it a little away from your zipper allowance. Okay, that's if you do not want to attach this to your zipper allowance. But since I'll be attaching mine, I will go on to pin it at the edge like this. Repeat the same thing at the other end, and then the excesses that I have will be distributed into pleats. So what I'm going to do right now is to find the midpoint of this flare, and we're going to be matching that midpoint to the center front. So right here is my own midpoint. I'll go ahead and notch it, and then I'll go on to attach it to the center front before we begin to do any pleats. So I'm going to create pleats right here, very close to the center front. I'll repeat the same thing for this other side so it can be uniform. Just make sure that the distance between the two pleats are the same, especially in front. If it's not the same, your outfit will be looking somehow. Okay, so I'll go on to measure mine. I have from the center front, I have 2.5 inches, and I have 2.5 inches, about 2.5 inches for this side, so that is fine. Then I'll go on to pleat the remaining excess that I have right here at the center back. Do the same thing as well at the center back, and then I'll go on to sew this part all around by 1/4 inch. So I'm gonna have to attach the peplum to the bodice, and as you can see, it already looks like a little very tiny baby's dress already. So what we want to do right now is to attach the skirt piece that we have sewed together, and we want to attach it in such a way that the seams are hidden. What I'm going to do right now is to grab the skirt piece. I'm going to place it in such a way that this part that has the hard net is touching the bodice directly. Do you understand? Such that by the time we flip this over, the peplum is going to be directly on top of the net. And then I'll go on to sew the entire thing by 1/2 inch seam allowance from beginning to the end. So after sewing, this is what we have right here. This is where our stitch is. So the peplum is going to cover this stitch. Okay, it is going to cover it like this. And you would see that this area is equally neat. Okay, so this is what we have for our dress. I'm going to use a zigzag stitch so as to hold this edge down, just to make it look neat on that side. And then what I'm going to do also is to trim the edge of the net so that they look even on this side before we are going to go on to attach the zip at the back. So I'll be using a skirt zip or a trouser zip because this dress is very tiny. It's very small. Okay, so I'll just attach one side of the zip right here. Okay, attach it right here. Where the zip will end, what I'll just do is go on to sew it close all the way down. And that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, kindly give us a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, turn on the bell so you get updates when I post new videos, and I'm going to be seeing you guys in my next tutorial. Bye!